Hi,
Hello.
we're in the Proclaimer's book. The chapter is They Are No Part of the World, and we're at this subheading When the World Went to War on page 191. Around the globe, the events of World War I severely tested the claims of those who professed to be Christians. It was the most ghastly war fought down to that time. Nearly the entire world population was involved in one way or another. Pope Benedict XV, in spite of Vatican sympathies for the Central Powers, endeavored to maintain an appearance of neutrality. However, within each nation, the clergy, Catholic and Protestant, maintained no such neutral stance. Regarding the situation in the United States, Dr. Ray Abrams, in his book Preachers Present Arms, wrote, quote, "The churches assumed a unity of purpose hitherto unknown in religious annals. The leaders lost no time in getting thoroughly organized on a wartime basis. Within 24 hours after the declaration of war, the Federal Council of the Churches of Christ in America laid plans for the fullest cooperation. The Roman Catholic Church organized for similar service under the National Catholic War Council, directed by 14 archbishops and with Cardinal Gibbons as president, demonstrated an equal devotion to the cause. Many of the churches went much further than they were asked. They became recruiting stations for the enlistment of troops." End of quote. There was a lot of ellipses in there too. What did the Bible students do?
Although they endeavored to do what they felt was pleasing to God, notice it says they felt, interestingly, their position was not always one of strict neutrality. What they did was influenced by the belief, shared in common with other professed Christians, that the higher powers were ordained of God, according to the wording of the King James Version, Romans 13:1. Thus, in accord with the proclamation of the President of the United States, the Watchtower urged the Bible students to join in observing May 30th, 1918, as a day of prayer and supplication in connection with the outcome of the World War. Interesting, eh? They're encouraged to pray for, well, something to do with the war effort, specifically. During the war years, the circumstances into which individual Bible students were thrust varied. The way they dealt with these situations also varied. Feeling obligated to obey the powers that be, as they referred to the secular rulers, some went into the trenches at the front with guns and bayonets. But having in mind the scripture, "Thou shalt not kill," they would fire their weapons into the air, or try simply to knock the weapon from the hands of an opponent. A few, such as Remigio Cuminetti in Italy, refused to put on a military uniform. The Italian government at that time made no allowance for anyone who, for reasons of conscience, would not take up arms. He stood trial 5 times and was confined in prisons and a mental institution, but his faith and determination remained unshaken. In England, some who applied for exemption were assigned to work of national importance or to a non-combatant corps. Others, such as Price Hughes, adopted a position of strict neutrality regardless of the consequences to them personally.
At least at that point, the overall record of the Bible students was not quite like that of the early Christians, described in The Rise of Christianity by E.W. Barnes, who reported, quote, "A careful review of all the information available goes to show that until the time of Marcus Aurelius, Roman emperor from 161 to 180 CE, no Christian became a soldier, and no soldier, after becoming a Christian, remained in military service. But then, at the end of World War I, another situation arose that called on religious groups to show where their loyalties were."
You know what I like about this, and I'll just show you the pictures. Here at the bottom of the right-hand page, you've got the two men that are mentioned in the last paragraphs.
Mm-hmm.
I like the fact that they're actually applauding men who were associated with Russell, who went according to their own conscience. And then you think, well, wait a minute now.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that the very thing you can't do now if you're a witness? Go with your own conscience?
And that is what Christendom does. They allow people to go by their own conscience, and there will be differences. There will be people coming down on different sides of this issue,
Mm-hmm.
but they allow you to decide for yourself what your conscience will allow or not allow.
Yeah. Oh, why is that? Why is the double thing here not apparent? If you're a witness just reading this, you think, well, see, some of our people were heroes. They did the right thing. But the point is, they didn't get counsel to do that. They went with what they themselves perceived to be the right thing to do in a circumstance like this. Mm-hmm. And most of the, as you admit here, it looks like most of the Russellites at that time were all over the place. Some of them were going into the trenches with weapons. Mm-hmm. Some of them were going in with weapons but not using them.
Some refused to completely. Others took up other jobs, right? So, there was more liberty to the individual believer to make his own mind up as to what he felt he could or couldn't do.
Now, before we say what we're going to say, we should admit that we are pacifists. So we found ourselves in our churches in the minority. That is, even when there was Remembrance Day, what the Americans would do Memorial Day. When we did Remembrance Day, we didn't go to church frequently because we didn't want to be associated with this. Well, it's not really a celebration of war. It's a celebration of the war dead, though. It's a commemoration of the war dead is a better way to think about it.
But we didn't feel comfortable to be there. What our church did do, which I thought was nice, is they allowed us to have a meeting, a group meeting, because we did group meetings on different discussions, and they allowed us to have one on war, pacifism.
But only about 10 or 12 people showed up for that discussion.
But many that were there were not pacifists.
That's right.
But there was an open discussion, and we read different things. We read scripture. We read, I can remember this quote, I think, about, in the early church, that Christians didn't become soldiers, and if they were if they were already a soldier, they declined.
Well, that was true, but there was no universal law in those days about this. The local churches and the bishops and elders had to decide based on, well, a lot of factors, just like you did back in World War I.
Yeah.
But it is generally true, we have to admit, that the churches as a whole bear some responsibility. But are they fatally compromised is the big issue here. And what you're missing, of course, is that since Old Testament religion is not based upon obedience, because if it were, everybody would be disqualified there, and they all died, so that proves they were disobedient in some aspect.
Yeah.
But what you're missing, of course, is that the people of God in the Old Testament, many of the most famous of them, were already guilty of bloodshed. So God tolerates these, what we would consider to be mistaken or even deadly mistakes in the case of, well, just name a few names. Abraham, he's guilty of bloodshed, even though it was for a good cause, you think.
To get Lot back.
To get Lot and his family back. Jacob is guilty of bloodshed, even if it's only in his own sons.
Yeah.
Because his sons not only cast away their brother and took for granted he was either a slave or dead by now.
And then killed a whole town.
Wiped out an entire town, males.
Yeah. And then
Moses,
Joshua.
Moses.
Yeah.
Murdered a man. Yeah, again, for the right reason. He's defending one of his own or his own people.
Yeah.
Joshua and the entire period of the judges, one judge after another, is guilty of bloodshed.
Yeah.
David, outstandingly. Even Josiah, the best king after David, goes out to war with Egypt, and his mistake does cost him his life, but it doesn't make him not a good king and not a good Israelite.
And it doesn't cut him off from God. This doesn't cut any of them off from God's people.
Yeah.
They aren't disqualified as believers because they're involved in those things, or they fall to those things, like
Though-
when you think of murder.
Though they might lose privileges.
So David was not allowed to build the temple. That was a consequence of he had blood on his hands, but it didn't disqualify him from being God's servant.
Yeah, and Josiah.
Because the covenant that they're basing their confidence in is from God.
And
it's His promises, and He's faithful.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
So no, it didn't disqualify them as God's people, and we would probably say that well, they didn't have as much light then. Well, they had the law of Moses. You shall not murder is right there, number 6 in the Ten Commandments.
Yeah.
They didn't view warfare though as murder. They viewed it as defending the right.
Yeah, and that's the way many Christians would think. They are defending their country. That's the way they think of it. But you're going to get a variety of positions among Christians as to how they think of it.
And I remember my dad telling me, even though we had some pretty violent discussions over the breakfast table or dinner table about this very issue in the pacifist 60s, right? The protest movement was on, and I was part of sympathetic with the protest movements against the Vietnam War. But my dad would simply say, well, at the time, we thought we were doing the right thing. We thought there was no alternative because when he joined the war effort, like my two grandfathers, England was committed. You thought, as you admit here, Romans 13, therefore, is about this very decision you have to make. If your country calls you to defend it against a foreign invader, as England was being invaded by Germany in the year my dad was called up, when he was 18, I believe, or 19.
I would think that you have an ongoing discussion about this, not just in Christian circles, but in secular circles, and in the movies.
Yep.
Many movies are made that are considered pro-war and sometimes anti-war. Same movie, a lot of the time, is viewed that way because it depends on your perspective. But I think if we look at these things or have conversations about that, we have to make an effort to try and understand why a person falls on a different side than we do.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean you're going to just agree with them, but you will have more understanding then of the other person's position.
We can promote right here 2 of the greatest movies ever made, and 2 of the most successful movies ever made are very much on this borderline between what is this pacifist or is it not?
Yeah.
And I'm thinking of All Quiet on the Western Front. Some of you will have seen that. 1930, won the Oscar for Best Picture. And the man playing the lead, who was only about 22 at the time, is Lew Ayres, who in real life was a pacifist and paid the price for that in the Second World War by losing jobs.
Yeah.
But in the movie, he's a German soldier, and they're very pro-war. This is World War I, of course, that they're picturing here. Very pro-war, and gets gradually disillusioned as the war goes on, as young people tend to be, realistically, on both sides.
There's a number of movies that show it from that perspective.
But then you've got the other movie, which is the biggest box office film of the very year when America got into World War II, Sergeant York, a true story about Alvin York, who was pacifist, and was called up, and at first just wanted to dodge the draft, as many did in the Vietnam era, and fled into the hills.
Yeah.
Was thinking he was going to flee into the hills to get away from the American draft.
And he was influenced by the Romans
13, but also by give to Caesar the things that belong to Caesar.
Yeah.
So he was turned into a pacifist who didn't want to use his weapon, like some of your guys. But when his own men were under attack, he just did what he thought he had to do and defend them against attack. Yeah. So men are all over the place about this, and it's very interesting that both those films can be viewed as pro-war or anti-war.
Yeah, yeah.
Depending on what side you're on.
Yeah, and there's many movies like that. Friendly Persuasion is another one that's like that. About
the Quakers, who make the same rule you now make, which is, no, you can't be a Quaker and involved in war and bloodshed. And of course, my dad told me about a Quaker in Stockport, where he lived, who paid the price, lost his job as a teacher because he wouldn't go to war in World War II.
Yeah.
My dad seemed to admire that, just like you admire people with a good conscience here.
Yeah, they would follow their conscience even if it wasn't to their advantage, economically or even peer pressure wise.
Well, think of the two, among the ones we've mentioned here, the two kings that stand out, David and Josiah. David lost the privilege of
building the temple
because he had blood in his hands, Chronicles tells us. But he also lost because he made mistakes in his life, which made him, at least temporarily, a man God could not use. He couldn't build a temple.
Yeah, it cost him in other ways, like
family, yeah, and even almost cost him the kingship at one point when he had to flee his own son. But Josiah, he never even made it into his 40s. He dies in a battle. You can fantasize of what Israel would have been like if Josiah had lived a normal life, but he didn't, because he made a mistake, went to war, and his sons were not Josiah. And it was a mess from then on until the exile. So we will lose if we make wrong decisions, but we won't cancel ourselves as the people of God. So I guess the question is, and I think our link is attached to this idea too, isn't it? That think of Joseph, think of Moses. Was Joseph disqualified as one of the people of God, or even one that is primarily used by God, by the fact
being a politician,
that he's mucked up with Egyptian politics, and he actually becomes the ruler of Egypt, de facto ruler, right? And Moses, is he disqualified by the fact that he murdered an Egyptian when he was 40 years old?
And was worldly educated.
Yeah. All the things that you think cancel you.
Yeah.
From the blessing of God, if not the people of God, yeah.
Yeah.
See you next time.